in terms of like the societal level discussion, like what do you think is within the realm of possible to like move the trajectory in a more positive, less less materialistic, nihilistic, reductionist, direction? What would that
Yeah,
look
wow,
like?
that's a really big question, and it's it's going to be hard to answer, but I'll do my best. First,
It'll
let
be
me
a
say
great
that
foreshadow for
yeah,
part two. Yeah.
let me say that political philosophy is probably my weakest area, and that's interesting because it's one of the areas I
Yeah.
was first most interested in. I was very liberal, then I was very libertarian. But once you do political
Hmm.
philosophy, you quickly realize there's a lot of ethical considerations. That brings you to ethics, and then once you start thinking about ethics, it's hard not to think about metaphysics. And since I got into metaphysics, I sort of never stopped, right? So at some point, I'll have to like
Oh,
work back
funny. That's
through
interesting. Yeah, yeah.
and straighten out my. Now I've straightened out a lot of my political philosophy because everything's connected, and once you make metaphysical adjustments, very likely that'll cause ethical adjustments, and very likely that'll cause adjustments in your political philosophy. So I
See,
don't
I
have
was a
a
poli
fully
sci free law type of guy, so that's actually like that's my like home turf is where I think about things is through that like that lens, and then I have to like
yeah
take myself out of that lens to think more about like, well, let's think about like societal questions and issues of family and tradition that aren't necessarily political, but then it's
right.
like I find myself getting pulled back into that sort of political question.
Yeah, so I know I'm not a libertarian anymore. I know at least that much. And Plato's helpful because in the Republic he's trying to answer what the question of justice is, at least for the human person. But he thinks we can kind of figure that out by looking at the large scale, which is the state, right? And he goes
Right.
through different qualities that the state can go through, from aristocracy to oligarchy, to, timocracy, sorry, oligarchy, and then democracy for Plato is like one step
Yep.
before tyranny and stuff like that, right? Where is America in Plato's scale? I mean, at best, it's oligarchy, right? And
It's a grim at best.
at,
Yeah.
at grim at best, it's oligarchy. If not, maybe one of the latter two. And it's important for Plato. He's not like in that project. He's not necessarily against like the idea of a constitutional republic. For him, democracy is a sort of qualitative state of the state's
Yeah.
soul,
Yeah.
right? There's a disordering here where
Right.
reason has been overtaken by the appetites and stuff like that, right? Yeah, that probably describes America in a lot of ways, right? So what's possible on the large scale? That question hurts my brain. So I always try to think about, well, where should we start first? And that is, of course, what is closest to you and closest to home. So I try to avoid, and we encourage other people to avoid, if you're trying to change the world through Twitter, but you're neglecting your family, something's gone horribly wrong, right? Your obligation is to
Right.
pursue your happiness, and part of that, if you have a family, is to pursue the good of your happiness. And there are things right in your immediate proximity that bear a stronger moral obligation than you going and fighting political battles on Twitter, even if they might make a difference, right? There is a sort of moral
Yeah.
priority
Yeah.
and hierarchy. So I think proximity matters when considering um, moral obligations, definitely. So that's one thing. Then there's a lot you can do locally, not just in your immediate family. That's where you have the biggest effect, but even your local communities as well. I think it is important to get involved in your local communities and local politics and get the sorts of people in charge, because as crazy as the wider world gets, there's a lot you can do locally, to shield and protect and
Yeah.
set up structures. So I would like people kind of thinking in that way as much. Not to say that the wider perspective doesn't matter, but there's more things you can
Right.
control the closer you are to home that are going to make an immediate difference. So that's the first thing I
Right.
would say. Other than that, I mean, our country is obviously deeply divided. I think laws do matter. I'm not a political determinist. I think culture impacts laws. I also think laws impact culture, obviously. I mean, obviously,
Right.
obviously,
Right.
obviously so. So I think if there's opportunities to change laws, even if they don't even if they would be culturally unpopular, but they point in the right moral direction, I think those opportunities should be seized upon. You should campaign for those opportunities, as long as you don't think that there's some sort of imminent horribly worse outcome that would happen from it. I think that is important because, again,
Right.
people take moral signals from the laws, right? But laws are also often crafted depending on cultural attitudes. So I think it works both ways. So I resist the idea that
Yeah.
you shouldn't try to push for laws just because they're unpopular or they don't have a chance of succeeding. Many laws have succeeded that were hugely
Right.
unpopular, and then 10 years later, it's just sort of like it's hugely influenced culture downstream. So I think fighting legal battles as far as possible is cultural and legal are both highly important in that respect. So sorry, I threw a lot of stuff out there, and I don't know if any of it actually answers your question.
I love it.